Really, when it comes to this specific rule, it's just cutting it off at the knees. Now, the biggest pollution source out there is transportation. This ruling means he doesn't have the authority to apply the clean air rule to oil and gas companies that don't emit anything themselves, but they do provide what the vehicles then emit. This was a 5-4 decision. It was very close. I do want to read you the majority ruling here. It was Justice Deborah Stevens who wrote, "The issue is not whether man-made climate change is real. It is. Nor is the issue whether dramatic steps are needed to curb the worst effects of climate change. They are. Instead, this case asks whether the Washington Clean Air Act grants Ecology the broad authority to establish and enforce greenhouse gas emission standards for businesses and utilities that do not directly emit greenhouse gases, but whose products ultimately do." And the conclusion to this ruling is that they don't. Here's the governor today.
The Supreme Court decision means that we no longer have a way to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. So the need for the clean fuel standard has doubled since last evening.
Okay, so the governor pushing some of the legislation that lawmakers were looking at. Legislative session just kicked off this week. Look, we've seen the governor try over and over these different ways to tackle carbon. This attempt, one the court largely overruled, was after the legislature failed to adopt a cap and trade program that he championed years ago. So back in 2015, he tried to go about it himself. He was directing the Department of Ecology to regulate factories and other industries, but also the oil industry, with transportation, of course, again, being the biggest emitter. So Senator Doug Erickson, he's a Republican, he responded to this ruling today. He said this case was a classic example of government arrogance and overreach. The court was right to rein in the Inslee administration and the Department of Ecology. The people and their representatives in the legislature cannot be cut out of the decisions that will affect their lives. Now, the Association of Washington Business fought this ruling. They told me today they're happy the court found the executive went too far. They said the rule as is would have passed on costs directly to families. But for both parties, it's really not a home run here. When it comes to the AWB, they are concerned about the manufacturing sector, which still does fall into this ruling. And they are saying they're worried the industry might decide to move out of Washington state and take those jobs with it, try to go to states that maybe have higher carbon emission allowances. Coming up at 5 o'clock, look, this governor's not out of options here. We know the legislature is in session, but he could also go about it a different way and try to get them to approve more authority for his executive branch. We're going to be explaining that later on in about an hour.
Okay.